Okay, we're still on the, we're going to go ahead and resume our meeting. It's 1 o'clock, and we are still on item number 7. Excuse me, item number 8. Jeff Doyle's going over the privacy protection discussion, and I think we've got most everybody here.
What we lack in quantity, we make up for in quality.
I was going to say, there you go. So go ahead, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will slow it down a little bit. I'm sorry about having to pick things up a little bit too fast the first half, but I think we're in good position for the rest of the meeting as a result. Just to briefly review what we did is we went through the definitions of privacy and what we're talking about. Then we looked at the constitutional and statutory privacy protection environment. We took a brief look at 4 laws in California that have to do with privacy protections regarding transportation, technology, and revenue collection. And now what we're going to do is turn our attention to the operational concepts that the TAC has so far advanced for further review, and we're expecting, pending any changes that you make, that we're going to move forward with these operational concepts. And we're going to be looking at them from the lens of these 4 questions that we talked about earlier. And again, the 4 questions are: what type of PII is required in order to administer the road charge system? How will it be collected, the method of collection? How and which information is being transmitted? And then finally, how is the information used? So it's with those 4 questions in mind that we are going to turn and look at the operational concepts. This is probably the best time left in today's agenda for us to draw your attention to a work product that you had requested at the last meeting. And this is the privacy features at a glance, we will call it. And it should be in your briefing materials. And it looks like this. Your version is probably color. But what it is a matrix of the operational concepts across the top row. And then down the left column are questions or criteria that, and it's really written from the perspective of a potential motorist or driver that would be interacting with this system. The types of things that they might want to know before they make a choice on which operational concept to adopt in the pilot program. And so that might be helpful for you to look at as we're clicking through these next 4 or 5 slides, which are on their operational concepts themselves. So you can see what the motorist might see, you know, at the point where you've settled on things and we're actually presenting things to volunteers versus the more detailed information on the slides. Also, all of this is contained in your briefing books as well. The first operational concept is the time permit. And again, this is the notion that a motorist would buy a permit to drive an unlimited number of miles for a given period of time. It could be a year, it could be a quarter, perhaps a month. But you drive until the time is expired, and you don't have to worry at this point about any of the mileage information being collected or transmitted or how it's used, because there is no mileage information in this concept. The only thing that's needed is the motorist's entry into the road charge database reflecting the fact that you bought a time permit, and you're good to go until your permit expires. The next concept is the mileage permit. And this is where roadway use is recorded by the vehicle's odometer, but in this instance it's manually reported by the motorist when they buy a mileage permit. And that would authorize the driver's vehicle to be driven on the roadway for a set number of miles, a fixed number of miles. So the way that the concept has been described is that it could be for 12,000 miles, it could be for 1,000 miles, but you would purchase only the amount of miles that you expected to use or consume, if you will, of the roadway for a given period of time. Getting a little bit deeper into, more detailed operational concepts, the next one is the odometer charge. And again, this is where roadway use is recorded using the vehicle's odometer, but in this instance, the motorist is reporting an odometer reading to whoever is doing the account management, whether it would be government or a commercial account manager. And the motorist would, in the operational concept you have in front of you, is self-report, or self-report over the internet. It could be done via smartphone app. It could be done via mail-in postcard. But when we talk about enforcement in a couple months, obviously the question is going to come back, well, how do we know that the motorist didn't exceed the amount of miles that they paid for? What's the reconciliation process? But up front, the issue here is that, yes, you do need to report mileage for whatever period of time annually, I think is what we've assumed that it would be, and that at some point may have to be verified. The next operational concept, and these are the ones that are getting into the technology options. If motorists want the technology options, this is what we think they'd be looking at, is what we now are calling electronic mileage metering. So that was another item that you asked us to come back to you with. How do we avoid the other term that we were using for the OBD2 plugin? And a mileage meter is what seemed to resonate with the most people. So looking forward to your feedback, and if you have better ideas, but we're going to move forward with mileage meter. This is where the motorist, if they choose this option, they would install a device that measures the distance the vehicle travels and reports it to an account manager, but it's all miles. It does not have any location capability, not even general location capability to detect where or even when the miles were traveled. But it is reporting mileage to a commercial account manager most likely. And the last concept, the spicy part, I guess, is the electronic mileage metering with general location. Now, if motorists choose this, it is an in-vehicle device, just like the last one. It monitors or records the amount of mileage driven on taxable roadways, whatever you determine taxable roadways to be. You're going to have that question in front of you a little bit later in the agenda, and you can decide whether you want to include in-state, out-of-state, all those questions that Shannon put to you earlier. You'll decide, and then that will be the operating basis for determining which miles are taxable. So there would be a reconciliation of, okay, the motorist went on these roads and these miles are taxable. That gets dumped into, I guess, recorded into a bucket where it just shows up as taxable miles, and then that's what the motorist would pay on. That is the one I want to make sure is clear that does require GPS or some sort of location-based technology to make that happen. So with that in mind, this is really transitioning to the questions that you will have this afternoon and what you might want to do about these, if anything. This month we're looking at the privacy protection approaches. So what do you want to do, if anything, to try to bolster the privacy protections in the pilot project beyond what is contained in Senate Bill 1077? And there are 4 of them that we are going to put in front of you on the next page. You can select one, you can select multiple, you can mix and match if you want, or take parts of some and others, but we've tried to tee them up, and I think as you'll see in the staff recommendations later, in a way that is probably a good jumping off point for your discussion. If or when you adopt what those approaches will be, then next month we will come back and have a briefing on data security, which is really the other half of the privacy issue, at least in regards to a road charge system. In July, you will have, I guess I'm calling it a mock-up of the choices that you've made to date and where are we at in terms of the cost, the complexity, what's it look like to the drivers, how would it operate, and then you can start, if you want to making some further refinements to your operational concepts. And then in August, finally, is probably the last formal presentation that we would have on a privacy-related topic, even though the discussion will be at each TAC. And that will be on enforcement measures and whether or not you want to simulate enforcement in the pilot project itself. And perhaps that is influenced somewhat by a reconciliation of whether you're going to try to collect either some sort of real charges or monetary value or what, but enforcement will be dealt with later. So that's how we see the progression, at least in terms of the formal information we'll put in front of you on privacy.
Comments or questions for Jeff?
The only question I have, and maybe you're going to be talking about it at some later date, is in all this type of monitoring, there seems to be some concern about the reporting. So whether you either have to have somebody verify the mileage by the odometer, take a picture, whatnot, how are you going to allow for the person to get onto a private road and not be charged for those miles?
Yeah. If the TAC makes the decision that in the pilot they want to simulate that, then right now, the choice for the motorist is this last option, the last operational concept, which is the GPS-enabled device.
Jeff, before we go on the next item, was your intent to go through this last slide in a little bit more detail?
We could do it now, but it's also actually teed up in the policy decision-making that you're going to undertake a little bit later in the agenda.
Okay.
So in the interest of time, we can,
Yeah, and that's fine
Move on.
to keep moving ahead. One observation I would have on your different approaches on this slide is I assume there's a possibility of overlapping or multiple parts of these. It's not one approach, 1, 2, 3, or 4, but it could be overlapping.
that's correct, yes. Sure. Yes, with the chair's permission, I'd be happy to at least highlight them for you, so it's not cold when you get it in a few minutes. Approach 1, so we put 4 in front of you, and again, there will be some staff recommendations, but just so that you understand basically what they involve. The first approach is what we've labeled a governance approach. There's more detail on it on page 46 of the briefing book if you happen to bring it. If not, if you reflect back, well, let me start with this. It's a principles-based, privacy principles-based approach, where the TAC would take basically a policy decision adopting privacy principles that in turn would govern the rest of the pilot project, including the operational concepts and how they're implemented. And importantly, at the end, when it's time to have an independent evaluator come in and see how we did on privacy measures, to evaluate, I don't want to call it audit, but to measure the performance of the pilot and how we did on the privacy protection measures against whatever principles you adopt. So an example of the principles, Kurt Augustine earlier this morning showed you what the Auto Alliance has put forth as their principles. In the briefing book, we cobbled together from different sources some privacy principles that seem like they would be a good starting point if you want to go that direction. We're not looking for any wordsmithing or any authoring in the course of a TAC meeting. If you decide to do that, then we would, of course, come back to you in the interim periods with something to look at. The second approach is really more of a specifications approach. In those slides that I just showed you on each operational concept, there was a table. There we posited some privacy concerns that we've heard not only from TAC members, but just in general public comments. And then we've tried to propose design solutions. So approach number 2 is really asking the TAC in some respects to be specific and get into the details about what types of measures or countermeasures, if you will, to ensure that PII and other privacy expectations are protected. The third approach, we've labeled it accountability approach. As I described with approach number 1, this is the idea where you would actually take not only the privacy protection principles, if you decide to adopt those, but in the evaluation criteria, which you're going to hear about from Travis Dunn in a moment, you would also include that and essentially evaluate not only the pilot project and its operations against some privacy criteria, but the entire program, including the adequacy of the privacy protections that you adopted in the first place. So if they fell short, then that would be a finding in the evaluation. The last approach is, excuse me, if you recall, 1077 had a requirement that you include legal, quote, legal protections. This is the best attempt that we could come up with at meeting that, and this is adopting or at least recommending a model legislation that would apply to road charging that has privacy protection measures. And this notion is to take what you have read and heard a little bit about today from other laws that don't currently apply to road charging and to bring them all together into new legislation that would be model legislation. And the important point here is that it would not require the legislature to act. It's model legislation, and it's a chance to test drive, okay, if the TAC or the California State Transportation Agency or a legislator wanted to propose new legislation regulating privacy for road charging, how would it work? And you have a chance to test that in the course of the pilot. So those are the four approaches that we're putting in front of you today.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I appreciate that. And as I think it was clarified earlier, there could be a grab bag of options within these or layering, as it were, of some of these in multiple ways. Are there questions for Jeff before we go on to Travis's presentation? Lee?
Yeah, Jeff, I was curious about the August date, because I guess it feels like I would want to know how you see the enforcement privacy issues actually as part of thinking about this. So, it's not absolutely essential, but it would be a more complete sort of understanding of it, because enforcement often actually raises some very, very concrete issues, and I would hate to sort of, for instance, one might be attracted to a high-level governance approach and then realize, well, you've got to actually have some real specific rules when you get to enforcement and collection and stuff, which actually forces us might drive you to a much more sort of regulatory code-like approach. So it just seems like I don't know enough about what would be involved at that point, but I'm concerned that there's sort of this.
Right. No, I understand, and we recognize that. In fact, many of the questions that the TAC has had related to privacy, they actually often are through the lens of enforcement. What are you going to do to enforce this thing, and what is government going to be doing to enforce this thing? That might change how we view the privacy protections. So that's why, in this instance, some have commented, well, it seems kind of squishy because we're asking them to take an approach, but we're not putting policies or laws in front of them. And the reason is because we want to have you give us guidance on some approaches that you think are promising. They don't have to be your final approaches. And then as we go through this progression of information, including essentially the enforcement issue, it wouldn't be probably until that point that we would start to actually finalize. I mean, you could say, well, we've decided we don't want to, we want something a little more detailed than, say, the governance approach, or maybe we want something less detailed than the specifications approach, because now we've heard about privacy and we're understanding the interaction. The decision point, though, in August is, do you want to simulate enforcement in the pilot project?
Any other questions for this item?
So we're going to come back and have this discussion again?
Right. I think we have two more presentations before we're going to get into the phase of this meeting where we're going to be really starting to hash through and make some recommendations or decisions. Correct. So I think that's the... Any others? Okay, great. With that, thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And I guess we're on to Travis with item number 9, if I've got it right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Good afternoon, and I'm excited to have a chance to speak with you all today about two topics. The first one is the introduction to the business case analysis. And there's a lot of material in the briefing book on this, so the presentation will take a slightly different tack, no pun intended. First, we're going to introduce the business case in general very briefly, because a lot more information about that in the briefing materials. But one of the purposes of the business case is to provide information about dollars and cents, costs and revenues. So we wanted to address a few particular topics that have recurred related to road charging, and they are a little bit more background about how the fuel tax is collected, a brief look at some other utility and tax revenue collection mechanisms and what they cost to collect, and then finally a discussion of vehicle classification frameworks, which is it's a bit of a pedantic discussion in some senses, but it's important when we get to the question this afternoon about which vehicles to include in the pilot that we all have a very similar vocabulary. So for example, when we say trucks, we all know what that means, and we have a clear definition of it. Are we talking about pickup trucks? Are we talking about box trucks? Are we talking about tractor trailers? So there's a lot of loose vocabulary, and we wanted to go over some of that today. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to interrupt. I have about 20 minutes worth of slides, and I think there's an hour for this agenda item. So So the introduction to the business case analysis, because the idea of a road charge, the objective is essentially to create a sustainable revenue stream, we think it's important to focus on net revenue. There's a theoretical idea of gross revenue, which is to say we can do lots of theoretical calculations about how many miles people drive in California and what types of rates we might someday want to charge per mile and calculate how much revenue that generates. But that's not actually the revenue that ends up available to spend on transportation. You have to think about how much of that money can you actually collect. Some of the money doesn't actually get collected. There's leakage. And then, of course, the issue that we heard about earlier today in public comment about cost of collection. So big part of the business case analysis is to understand net revenue, and this is the only equation I'll put on my slides on this particular presentation. It's fairly straightforward. When we talk about net revenue, we're talking about gross minus leakage, which includes evasion, and minus the cost of collection. And your input is really important to us because there are a lot of variables that determine what is gross revenue, what is leakage, and what is the cost of collection. Some of those variables we can control. We call them policy variables. So for example, gross revenue is a function of which vehicles are subject to a road charge, what rate we charge, whether we treat out-of-state vehicles, and what types of miles we exempt, which again is a question for today. There's some other factors that are out of our control, like how many miles people will drive, which is more of a function of things like economic performance and the price of gas. And then also how many gallons of fuel people consume. So if we're going to be crediting back fuel taxes already paid, well, how much fuel tax is paid, that's also something that's not really in our control. But we do have control over those policy variables, and those have an important impact on gross revenue. Leakage, which, yes?
So, several mileage exemptions or road exemptions has come up. One of the public comments we got in a letter talked about exemption, other kinds of exemptions, and I just want to ask, when are we going to be talking about that question?
Did you mean mileage exemptions or other types of
No,
exemptions?
I mean, you know, for instance, an exemption for low-income households, a deduction of, you know, first X miles is exempt.
I don't believe it's an agenda item today.
Yeah, it's on 11C of today's agenda.
Chair, I believe that's talking about the mileage exemptions on 11C. It's not necessarily exemptions for low income.
Oh, right, I was just reading into exemptions, period.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you can add on any kind of exemption you want and float it with the committee and see if that can get some...
Yeah, well, I'm happy for it to come back.
Sure, sure.
Well, and then, I guess that's just a point of clarification. You know, are we looking at exemptions there conceivably broadly or as broad as we want to consider or not? Or is there a time coming up at a future meeting where other exemptions beyond these were being considered? Or
We're going to put that on the parking lot for right now,
Okay.
and we will bring it back at a
fair
future
enough.
meeting.
Okay.
The next item in this equation is leakage, and in the briefing book we talk about three different types of leakage. There's evasion, which is when individuals deliberately try to avoid paying their obligation. There's also negligence, which is usually accidental, and then there's also what we're calling systemic errors. So there could be, for example, odometers are not 100% accurate. There is a tolerance. Most odometers are accurate within a couple of percentage of true distance. That's an example of a type of systemic error or deviation that you want to take into account when you're calculating the actual revenue that's going to be collected from a road charge system. So you have some policy
I'm
control.
sorry,
Yeah.
a point of clarification on this also. You have two sort of rows, I guess, on this, the policy variables and the economic and technical. Had you said earlier that the policy ones are sort of more in the purview of the pilot and the other ones are not? Or is it more blurred than that?
Policy variables are things that bodies like this and legislature can exercise some control over.
Because I guess on the evasion one, I think, you know, how the pilot and how an ultimate program is run and various decisions and technologies and processes that are developed can have a big impact on evasion. So I think that is within the control of all of this.
Absolutely, and I think it's a function of how we enforce it. and it's a function of, for example, penalties and how we design the operational concept. So our control is through the enforcement and through the design of the system. No system is perfect. There's evasion even of fuel taxes. It's quite small relative to other taxes, but you're right. It's a trade-off between enforcement and evasion that we want to understand that. At some point, you want to optimize the trade-off. The last part here is cost of collection. This is a challenge. It comes up a lot in conversations about road charge. It came up earlier today. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. And one of the things that we want to do with the business case is to provide at least an introductory sense of the cost of actually implementing and operating a road charge under the various operational concepts that have already been proposed. And through the experience of the pilot test, we'll actually get some data back that will allow us to refine those estimates and have a better expectation of what it might actually cost in a full-scale system. So the types of policy variables that you could influence to reduce cost of collection, it all has to do with the types of methods that are being proposed, decisions you've already made, for example, about using potentially private account managers, having simple interoperability with other jurisdictions. These are types of policy choices that you can make to drive down cost of collection. Some things are out of our control at the policy level. There will inevitably be in any tax system agency costs, labor, tax collectors, accountants, auditors, and that costs money. So those costs are we call them technical variables or technical costs. And also on the private side, if there are private account managers, their costs are reflective of the evolution of the marketplace in both technology and the business models out there to do things like, I won't use the word telematics necessarily, but the OBD2 type telematics in that business model drives costs as well. Been working with the project team, Caltrans, to collect data from as many sources as possible to inform our analysis of revenue, potential revenue, and costs. We've been reaching out to Board of Equalization, which currently collects the fuel tax in California. Of course, Caltrans, Air Resources Board, DMV. And then whenever we need additional data to inform our analysis, there are other institutional sources outside of California at the federal level, Energy Information Administration, FHWA, Department of Labor, and so on. And I would like to make a request of Mr. Marcantonio. I heard you mention this morning a data source about VMT by socioeconomic strata. That's the type of information that we like to collect and use it as part of our business case analysis. So we're constantly sort of scouring and would appreciate if we could.
And I shared that with Carrie already.
Great. Thank you so much. That's great. If other members have other general data sources that you would like to share, we take all comers. And one slight comment about the survey questions that were discussed this morning. We'll actually get some interesting information from those questions about how many miles people think they drive, what type of fuel economy they think they get. This is perception. It's not necessarily actual data because perceptions can sometimes vary from reality, but we can actually use that information in the business case.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the leakage question, because I was curious what data, what data justifies any projections about leakage, and then second, I wanted to at least get a sort of a ballpark on what the revenue shortfall or the revenue impacts of leakage. I mean, and the policy reason why I'm curious about it is that what I find in many technical legal systems is that leakage is small, but because it exists at all, then privacy invasive things get added in, even though if you sort of looked at it, it's like, gee, this is 0.01%, but because of that, a system that does not invade privacy at all then creates privacy problems. And from a policy standpoint, the smarter thing to do is just write off the leakage and not worry about if it's that small. So that's why I'm curious about what sort of empirical data supports, what any leakage estimates.
Thanks for the comment, and the question is a good one. It's really hard to estimate leakage because you don't know what you're not getting. We do have some benchmark data from places like New Zealand that operate a road user charge on light vehicles. They do a pretty rigorous estimate of their leakage rates. We have benchmarks from other tax systems that we can use, utility systems. But the pilot test itself will also give us some sensibility about what the magnitude is. And then there's one other sort of potential source of data, and that's odometer fraud. There are cases of odometer fraud, and there potentially is data out there that we could use to inform potential leakage rates in a road charge system.
Any other questions, comments?
This is the schema, which is a logic flow. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm just going to say we have it. We're using this. It's sort of like a Rosetta Stone that informs the translation between what I'm delivering today in English and what we go back and do with the project team to crunch the numbers and generate analysis that's useful to you all.
And again, in the briefing book, does a good job describing this. There's a lot more in that briefing book, so if you haven't had a chance to study it, I read every word this morning, and I was very impressed.
Thanks. The next topic is fuel tax collection. This is not treated, it's in the appendix of the briefing book, but we understand there were some questions about how is fuel tax collected, what are the mechanisms, and there's also exemptions to fuel tax and refunds, and so that will help hopefully inform your discussion later today about mileage exemptions. So Brady Tactol and a few colleagues and I have been poring over fuel tax statute for the past few weeks, and we thought about just bringing a big stack of papers and letting you guys read through it, but perhaps it would be more impactful if we did a cartoon instead. So we're going to follow 1 barrel of oil. There it is. This is going to be animated. It's going to start delivered usually by pipeline to a refinery. By the way, this is a very simplified explanation of how fuel gets from a barrel into your vehicle and taxed. We had some conversations with the Board of Equalization to make sure that, yes, this is indeed basically how it works. There are, of course, lots of exceptions to these general rules, but I wanted to walk through the general process of how it happens. So 1 barrel of oil generates about 50 gallons of refined product in California. 26 of those gallons are gasoline, 8 are diesel, 6 are jet fuel, and then 10 are other things like asphalt and lubricants and materials that are used to make plastics. The illustration of the sort of tube-looking, colorful things are supposed to represent pipelines, because the gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel are most typically delivered by pipeline, whereas the other products are delivered by tanker, rail car, which is shown kind of falling off the side of the slide there. So a barrel of oil, 50 gallons of product, about half of that is gasoline, and about 8 gallons of it is diesel. So about 2/3 is taxable as fuel that we think about on-road fuel, gasoline and diesel. So we follow the 26 gallons of gasoline and the 8 gallons of diesel. When they leave the refinery, they're delivered typically by pipeline. There they are again, 26 and 8 gallons, to a storage facility or a supplier. In the language here is this is a terminal rack. The taxing of fuel occurs when fuel is removed from the terminal rack. The tax is imposed on the supplier, the person who's operating those big blue tanks. So they remove the fuel, they typically put it into a tanker truck, and at the moment it comes out, they pay a tax to the IRS for the federal component on the excise, 18.4 cents per gallon, and also to the Board of Equalization for the state component, which includes the base excise tax, 18 cents per gallon, the price-based excise tax, which will be 12 cents per gallon starting July 1st, and also the sales tax component on both gasoline and diesel. And on diesel, I believe it's going to be 13 cents per gallon base excise tax as of July 1st. So that's when the tax is paid. And when the guy who is supplying it, the blue icon there, sells it to the tanker, most likely he's going to recover what he paid in tax in the price that he charges to the tanker. So that's how the tax gets collected. The tanker is going to deliver the fuel to a filling station at retail, and that's where we all are most familiar, interact with gasoline, and if we have diesel vehicles, diesel. And the price gets passed up the chain. So the tax is collected upstream, but it's built into the price of fuel that you pay at the pump. So here we are now at the filling station. Where does the fuel actually go? Well, out of those 26 gallons of gasoline, 25 of them go into on-road vehicles, motorcycles, cars, SUVs, pickups, even some medium trucks. About 1 out of those 26 gallons goes into things like small aircraft, boats, lawnmowers, agriculture equipment. Non-road uses, so technically should not be taxable, because we're using the fuel tax to tax highway use. For diesel, 5 to 6 gallons goes mostly into heavy trucks, buses. 2 or 3 gallons goes into off-road uses, agriculture and so forth. And then I have one technical point here, which is the fueling station actually has to make a reconciliation on the sales tax component with the BOE after they actually sell it. So that's what that last little illustration is for. So here we have those 26 gallons of gasoline and those 8 gallons of diesel. 25 of the 26 gasoline were used on road, and 5 or 6 of the 8 gallons of diesel were used on road, and the rest was not used on road. So that takes us to the next topic: exemptions, refunds, and transfers. This gets a little bit complicated, but I'll try to keep it high level. There are 2 big categories of exemptions. One is off-highway uses. So if you have a logging truck, for example, and your operations are off-road, agricultural uses, trains use diesel fuel, for example, all of those off-road uses are exempt. In order to claim an exemption, you need to be registered with the Board of Equalization, and you don't pay the tax on the fuel when you purchase it from a seller. There are also constitutional exemptions. U.S. government agencies don't need to pay fuel tax, diplomats, and transit vehicles, I believe they don't pay diesel tax, but they pay gasoline tax except for 6 cents. They get a 6-cent exemption on gasoline tax. So those are exemptions. There are also refunds. If for whatever reason you are using fuel for an exempt purpose and you cannot claim the exemption administratively, you can apply for a refund later. There's lots of different categories of refunds. But again, generally speaking, if you use fuel off-road, you can claim a refund for any tax that you paid on that fuel. So for example, going to the very bottom of those little icons, that is a seal for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. If you are a Native American and you use fuel on tribal lands, you can send a refund claim to the Comptroller's office to get a fuel tax back for any fuel that you burned while driving on tribal lands, for gasoline only, not for diesel. If you own a small watercraft, you can claim an exemption, a refund for the gasoline that you use in that watercraft. This is funny, if and only if you own the watercraft and you also own the private lake on which you're operating it. So a lot of sort of arcane administrative...
But if you do it out in the bay, you're still going to pay the road tax.
If you do it within 3 miles of shore, you're paying tax. Once you go 3 miles offshore, you can claim a refund.
Oh, my. And you thought the road charge thing was complicated.
So the last category is what I'm calling transfers, and this is actually pretty interesting. It gives some sensibility to how the money is moved around in the highway account. There are 4 types of transfers out of the motor vehicle fuel tax that's collected. The first one is for agricultural uses for which no refund is claimed. So there's an assumption made that there are a lot of people using fuel for agricultural purposes that they shouldn't have paid tax on, but they did, and they didn't bother to claim a refund for it because it's kind of an onerous process to fill out all the paperwork. So an accounting is done, and the money that is estimated to have been used in that way is set aside and put into the Department of Food and Agriculture account. Same is true for light aircraft. There are some light aircraft that use gasoline. You can't actually get a refund if you put gasoline in a plane, even though you didn't use it on the road. However, they estimate how much tax was collected on that, and that money goes into the aeronautics account. Same is true for any boats that you use on public waters. If it's not a lake that you own, you can't claim a refund for it, but they estimate how much money that is, and it goes into the Off-Highway Vehicle Trust Fund. The Harbors and Watercraft Revolving Fund. And last but not least, there are a whole lot of uses for off-road. If you fill up your lawnmower with gasoline, technically you can fill out a form and claim an exemption or a refund for the fuel that you used with the Comptroller's office, but most people don't bother. So again, the money that's estimated to have been collected is set aside, and it goes into 3 funds: Off-Highway Vehicle Trust Fund, the State Parks and Rec Fund, and some goes to the general fund as well. Altogether, those transfers amount to about 5% of the total fuel tax base and price-based fuel excise tax that's collected.
And the refunds?
We don't have any data on how much the refunds are. We just learned from the Comptroller's office that they get a couple dozen claims a day, but we don't know how much the average claim is or how much it adds up to, but I suspect it's a pretty small amount. Well, we just asked yesterday, so we're, we're working on it.
They didn't say they could.
Correct. All right.
They knew you were going to ask the question, so they...
All right, so that's fuel tax. There's one other wrinkle, and unfortunately, Mr. Sauer has left the room. I was really hoping he could be here for this, to back me up. It's called the International Fuel Tax Agreement. This applies to heavy trucks, 26,000 pounds or greater, alone or in combination with other trailers, for example. If you use a heavy truck for interstate travel, you must register your vehicle with IFTA, which is a multi-jurisdictional treaty, basically, of the 48 lower U.S. states and 10 Canadian provinces, so 58 jurisdictions altogether. And for purposes of this example, we're going to pretend that we are based in Nevada, not California, and if you have a truck that is registered for IFTA, you only have to register in your home jurisdiction. So we live in Nevada. We're going to start in Reno, and we're going to drive from Reno to Fresno. Actually, sorry, before we leave Reno, we're going to put 140 gallons of diesel in Nevada into our tank. The diesel tax in Nevada is 27 cents a gallon, so that works out to $37.80 of tax that we paid to Nevada. Now we're going to drive from Reno to Fresno, drop off a load, pick up another one, and then we're going to continue on to Las Vegas. And we're not going to fuel up again because fuel is cheaper in Nevada until we get back to Nevada. So there's some numbers here that explain how many miles we traveled in Nevada. So the first segment of the trip was 300 miles from Reno to Fresno, 10 of those in Nevada, 290 in California. And these heavy trucks typically get 5-6 miles per gallon. At 5 miles per gallon, that means we burn 60 gallons. Then we're going to continue on to Vegas. Same math here, 400 miles. Most of it in California, we burn 80 gallons. So what does that mean about the fuel tax that we should have paid? Well, we drove 60 miles in Nevada, and at 5 miles per gallon, we only burned 12 gallons in Nevada. So we only owe Nevada $3.24 in fuel tax. On the other hand, we drove 640 miles in California at 5 miles per gallon, which is 128 gallons, so we should have paid $57.22 to California in fuel tax for the miles we drove in California. But remember at the beginning, we only paid $37.80 to Nevada. So how do we work out getting the fuel tax to the right jurisdiction? That's what IFTA does. At the end of every quarter, every truck fleet that is involved in IFTA has to submit a tax return in which they report every single mile driven by every vehicle in their fleet by jurisdiction and every single gallon of fuel purchased by jurisdiction and whether or not they paid tax on that fuel. You calculate all the numbers, you add them all up, and at the end you come up with one single number, which is your reconciliation. So in this example, we owe total $60.46. We only prepaid $37.80, so we have a balance due of $22.66. We pay that balance to Nevada, so we only have to deal with one jurisdiction. And then the IFTA Clearinghouse, which is located in Arizona, every quarter does a clearing operation where they make sure that every state gets the money that they're owed based on the miles driven by jurisdiction by all the trucks in IFTA.
So in other words, the truckers are already used to this mileage-based concept.
If you are an interstate trucker over 26,000 pounds, you have to report, and you travel interstate, you have to report every mile by jurisdiction every quarter.
Eric, you just gave the whole light lowdown for us on IFTA, so all we could say is that you guys are so used to this already, it's not even funny. I love it.
In California, there are about 20,000 IFTA accounts, which represent about 80,000 trucks, which is only about a third of the big Class 7, Class 8 trucks. The other two-thirds presumably are all doing in-state operations exclusively, which means they don't have to worry about this.
That was,
Are you going to talk about the fuel tax election cost associated with that? What's the administrative cost paid?
how much does that cost?
Okay. Do I have it on this? Yeah, here it is. So the categories of costs on all of these things that we just talked about, so the collection from the terminal rack, if you remember back to that blue tank, the supplier of fuel, there's only about 400 licensed suppliers from which BOE collects fuel tax. So that makes their job relatively easy, and they're very efficient because they only have to collect fuel tax from a few suppliers. IFTA, there's quite a bit more. They have 20,000 some odd accounts in California. But altogether, BOE gets compensated $28 million in the last fiscal year out of the motor vehicle fund as compensation for their costs of doing all of these things, which represents less than 1%. I think, yeah, it's 0.6% of the revenue collected. So it's quite a low number. It's quite an efficient tax. That also includes $4.6 million that goes to the controller because they're the ones who handle all the refunds processing for gasoline tax. Nationally, the total cost of fuel tax, state by state, it varies a little bit, but it's typically below 1%, averages about 0.9%.
So the IFTA collection, the administrative cost, I mean, that.
Yep.
IFTA is included in the 1%.
Yes.
So I am interested in what the administrative cost of IFTA is for collecting those dollars that they manage for the interstate trucks. And I think I'm hearing you say it's all
Yes.
incorporated within that 1% total.
That's correct. So the dollar value there for BOE, $27.8 million, includes I believe includes the operation to do IFTA. And every state has an IFTA operation. Every state audits at least 3% of account holders every single year. And when you're auditing, for example, at the IFTA division at BOE in California, when you audit a truck fleet in California, you're effectively doing that audit on behalf of all 58 jurisdictions because you're making sure that the reporting is done correctly, not only so that you get the tax that's due to California, but also so that the other jurisdictions get the taxes that are due to them correctly.
Is there any estimate on the leakage in that process?
Unfortunately, I have never come across any. We'll keep looking. So that concludes the fuel tax portion of the presentation. If there's any other questions, the next slide is kind of a segue from that, and it's just one table. And this kind of compares fuel tax with other forms of revenue collection that you may be familiar with. And when we talk about road charge, the example was given earlier today that it's useful to think about it as a public utility. So we've tried to show a few other examples of utilities, all of whom have many hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of accounts. There are companies like Verizon and AT&T that have potentially hundreds of millions of accounts, and they collect money from their customers every month. They have to be efficient about it because it doesn't make sense to spend all of your money collecting the money. You want to have some left over to actually provide the service. So here, this is just some examples. The New Zealand benchmark that we've talked about before, which includes road user charges on both heavy vehicles and about 500,000 light diesel cars, is about 4% of the revenue collected. The Oregon weight mile tax, which was referenced earlier in public comment, has a cost of collection of below 5%, just below 5%. And then there's some other utilities listed here: San Diego Water, Fresno Water, because we're in Fresno, and Pasadena Light and Power, all in the 5% range, give or take. So these are sort of typical collection costs that you might see in a utility operation.
So I'm not very good at math, and so I want to make sure my interpretation is not invalid. But so you're saying that the cost of collection on fuel tax is 0.9%. Let's just say 5% for road user or something like that. So then would I be wrong to say, oh, you just told me that the 2014-2015 costs for California agencies is about $32.4 million. So if I multiply that by 5, that's about $160 million, and that's how much I would project it would cost?
The math is correct. We will, in the course of the business case analysis, come about it differently. We're going to do a bottom-up cost estimate and cost assessment. Cost of collection is an output, it's not an input. So it's difficult to apply cost of collection from another system to a hypothetical system for California. And one of the tricks about cost of collection is it's really easy to make it lower by just raising the tax rate and collecting more money. Make the denominator bigger, the cost of collection goes down. The classic example of that was the London congestion charge, which in its first couple of years of operation had a cost of collection of 50%, which was rather high. So they doubled the cost, the charge, and all of a sudden, overnight, the cost of collection went down to 30%. So we don't want to apply the ratio. What we are going to be doing as the project team in the business case analysis is estimating the cost of collection bottom up, estimating the revenues bottom up. We'll compare them, and we'll come up with a metric on our own. It may well end up being 5%. We don't know. But yes, the math that you presented was correct.
I think you're a lot better than you give yourself credit for.
Okay. The last topic is vehicle classification frameworks, and I wanted to end with this topic because it leads into the question that you have slated for later this afternoon about which vehicles to include in the pilot. And we thought it would be really useful to have vocabulary so that we could all be talking about the same thing. So we've got 5 different dimensions about how to talk about vehicles. There are about 27 million registered vehicles in California. We're not going to test all of them. We're only going to test a subset. And one way of winnowing down the subset that you want to test is to talk about different classes of vehicles. So whether you do it by weight or age or commercial or private, we wanted you to have an understanding of what those definitions mean and what types of vehicles are in each class. So for example, when you hear the word passenger car, you probably have an image in your head of what a passenger car is, but there is no formalized definition of passenger car. In fact, in different states, it means different things. In California, a pickup truck is a commercial vehicle. It's not a passenger car. So I wanted to be really clear about the language here. So the first dimension that we wanted to talk about is weight. So there is an industry standard for trucks. When you're talking about weight class for trucks, it has 8 classes, and it's based strictly on weight. And when we say weight, we mean the gross vehicle weight rating, which is abbreviated GVWR, and that means the weight of the vehicle when it's loaded to its full capacity. So if your vehicle has a GVWR of 5,000, that means that the vehicle plus all the people in it, plus any cargo, plus fuel, can weigh 5,000 pounds. Question?
So you cited 27 million vehicles in California. We use the number 32 million.
I'm sorry. I have to give you a couple of caveats about why I said 27 million. I forgot to do that.
Yeah, I'm told I didn't read the briefing material because the chair is telling me it's all
You're right. We did put 33 million. So out of the number I gave you is 2 years out of date, first of all. So it's probably closer to 30 million now. But of those 33 million, about 2 million are trailers, and another 500,000 or so are exempt vehicles, which are not they don't pay for registration. They actually pay fuel tax though, which is government vehicles. And then there's a whole class of miscellaneous vehicles as well. So it depends which of those you count. So maybe we can just say 30 million.
There's a chart somewhere that, because I had that same question.
Okay.
There's a chart in the briefing material, I just can't find it.
But it
that
is
lists them all.
It is important because in my previous life, working for Transportation California, we were calculating in terms of making estimates of revenues and that sort of thing on the basis of 32 million registered vehicles as paying vehicles. Now, you obviously pay for registration, but you're not buying fuel to pull a trailer.
Exactly.
And other than the increased mileage that results from.
Yeah, but I also remember 600,000 vehicles were exempt plates too in here. Yeah, it was a big. Did you find what page it is in the briefing book?
68.
Thank you. I'm flipping all over the place here.
I have some numbers here
There
I
it
can
is.
read if you'd like. This is 2013 data, so it's a bit out of date, but I think the ratios are more or less the same. So if you want to know how many vehicles are in each of these weight classes, I'll read it out. Passenger cars and Class 1 trucks, which is the top light green category, is about 23 million. Class 2 trucks. Class 2 is pickups, large pickups, large SUVs, cargo vans. So that goes from 6,000 to 10,000 pounds. There's about 4.5 million of those. So Class 1 and Class 2 taken together are typically called light-duty vehicles. So altogether, there's about 27 million light-duty vehicles in California. So classes 3, 4, and 5 always trip me up because it's really hard if you're driving down the road and you're trying to pick out whether you see a box truck or a city delivery van. It's really hard to tell whether it's 3, 4, or 5 because the distinctions are pretty minimal. But there's 260,000 Class 3 trucks, 140,000 Class 4, 70,000 Class 5. Then when we get to Class 6, 7, and 8, we're getting into the bigger trucks that are more recognizable. There's 144,000 Class 6 trucks, 87,000 Class 7 trucks, and 223,000 Class 8 trucks. And I apologize, but the numbers I just read are not in your briefing materials. We will definitely post that in the follow-up memo. This chart is in your briefing book, and this is an initial attempt to do some revenue forecasting, which is always dangerous. But we tried to do it on a per-mile basis. And we did it using fuel economy projections from the Energy Information Administration, which is an authoritative national source on energy trends and fuel economy. It's part of the U.S. Department of Energy. So using their projections for vehicle fuel economy and the current rate of fuel excise tax per gallon, this is the trend line you can expect in the equivalent cents per mile paid by the average vehicle in each one of these classes. I should note that for classes 2B, 3, and then 4 and above, we also included weight fees. Weight fees are part of the regime that trucks pay, and we included that in the estimate of the per mile cost for that class of vehicles. So, yes.
So you're saying that there's light-duty vehicles that pay a weight fee?
Pickup trucks tend to pay a weight fee, but light-duty cars do not. They pay registration fee.
2B is pickup trucks?
2B is very large pickup trucks and vans. So,
Isn't it commercial? Isn't that the demarcation? It's the commercial vehicles in that light-duty category that pay weight fees.
yes, that's correct, right. So if you're a commercial vehicle in your light-duty, you do pay a weight fee, but it's quite low. For the light vehicles, I think it's $7. I could be wrong, don't quote me on that.
I found the chart I was looking at. It's actually on page 14 of the briefing material. It shows a total of 33.6 million registered
Got
vehicles,
it.
of which 24.7 are automobiles and motorcycles. Trucks and commercial, 8.2. Miscellaneous, which are your farm equipment, et cetera, 150,000. So the total fee paid registered is 33 million. And that's where I saw the 600,000 that are exempt. That's like police cars, fire trucks, et cetera. So total of 33.6.
One quick question, but now weight fees would not be affected by this, right? Those would be, it's only.
That's an existing CHP program.
That's correct. We included it in these estimates because, with respect to Mr. Sauer and his organization, we wanted to reflect that they do pay that additional cost, which passenger cars don't pay.
We're going to give Eric the floor in a little bit here.
Okay. Good. Another way you could classify vehicles is by age, and the easiest way to do that is by model year. And it's interesting, and this is just showing Class 1 and Class 2A vehicles, which is basically what we call passenger cars. The fuel economy and this is data from Air Resources Board, the on-vehicle fleet in California has been fairly flat, and I can't explain the blip. We still haven't gotten to the bottom of that from 92 to 2000, so I apologize, I can't answer that. But we're running between 20 and 25 mpg for the light vehicles in California. And that trend is obviously expected to accelerate, especially with the adoption of zero-emission vehicles. And we have some forecasts that we're putting together right now, which we'll bring to a future meeting, which extrapolate this curve into the future, and you'll see it shoot way up. You can also classify vehicles by their EPA-rated fuel economy, which is different from the CAFE-rated fuel economy, and that's an important distinction because we often hear a CAFE standard of 54.5 miles per gallon. That's a lab-tested value. The actual sticker window value that the EPA rates and that you would experience in your vehicle is quite a bit lower than 54.5. It's closer to 43. So that's the average that the automakers are targeting for 2025. But if we look at vehicles by fuel economy, and this is a chart that Chairman Daffer referenced earlier, and you convert the gasoline excise tax, which is going to be 30 cents per gallon starting July 1st, into a per mile charge based on miles per gallon, you can find what MPG you have across the lower axis, the x-axis there, So for example, if you have a 20 mile per gallon vehicle, which is approximately state average, you're already paying about 1.5 cents for every mile you drive in California. If you're above that, 55 miles per gallon, you're paying quite a bit less. And if you're below that, obviously you're paying quite a bit more. And the logic, especially for the very low MPG vehicles, which are mostly large trucks, is that because they're doing more damage to the road, to the pavement surfaces anyway, that their cost obligation should be higher. So a 5 MPG truck is paying 6 cents per mile. Another way to classify vehicles is by fuel type. Probably familiar with all the different fuel types and the emerging ones that are available in the marketplace, increasingly gasoline, diesel, which we would classify to include also things like biodiesel, natural gases, battery electricity vehicles like Teslas and Leafs, and then all sorts of hybrids. Mostly gasoline electric hybrids are the ones that we're most familiar with, but there are also plug-in gasoline electric hybrids that can theoretically run entirely on electricity, but if they do need to switch to gasoline mode, they can, like the Chevy Volt. There's also a category of, I don't know if they're properly called hybrids, but dual fuel trucks that run on both diesel and liquefied natural gas. Lastly, this is another term that often is used, but wanted to make sure that we understood the definition of a commercial vehicle in California. It's anything that's used to transport persons for hire or designed to transport property. So this includes most pickups. If you have a pickup and you use it for personal use, it's still considered a commercial vehicle, with some exceptions. Some station wagons and SUVs, if you're using them to haul goods or carry individuals for hire, are also considered commercial vehicles. And most vehicles that are above that 10,000-pound light-duty vehicle cutoff point are commercial vehicles. And then everything else is non-commercial, which includes everything listed there, like motorhomes, van pool vehicles, and agricultural equipment. A few examples, just to make it real. This is a Ford F-150. It's a Class 2A pickup because it has a GVWR of 8,200 pounds. Model year 2008, gets 15 miles per gallon, EPA-rated combined fuel economy, uses gasoline, and it is a commercial vehicle in California.
That's a question. The fuel economy of an older car, is that EPA number what it's likely to be getting today, or that's as new? And how much of a difference is there between the two?
This is an as-new value, so the EPA rated a new Ford F-150 in 2008 at 15 MPG combined. It does degrade some over time, most vehicles do, but they don't report, to my knowledge, estimates. We probably will have good data from Air Resources Board about that, though. Example 2 is a Honda Accord Hybrid. This is a passenger car, 2015, brand new, 47 miles per gallon combined. Its fuel type is gasoline hybrid, and it is a non-commercial vehicle, unless you're using it for commercial purposes. But most of these are non-commercial. And by the way, I learned a trick. Spent the last week in San Francisco, and I was really puzzling over how you can tell what a commercial vehicle is in California because it doesn't say on the plate. So passenger cars have 3 letters in the plate. Commercial vehicles have 1 letter, and the rest are numbers. So that was a lot of fun for my friends in San Francisco to have me going around pointing out all the commercial vehicles. Last example is a Class 8 Freightliner, 60,000 GVWR, brand new, 2015, fuel economy, 4 or 5, 6, depending on how heavy the load is that you're hauling. It's a diesel fuel vehicle, and it is commercial. So, in conclusion, when you get to the question about how to classify vehicles and how to use them, or which vehicles you would like to recommend, at least at this point in time, to include in the pilot, you can think about these 5 dimensions: weight, age, fuel type, fuel economy, and commercial. You can specify certain vehicles by weight, by age. It's obviously it's the purview of the TAC to have this conversation and decide. We'd only ask that you don't develop a null set. In other words, for example, we recommend vehicles above 50,000 pounds that get 30 miles per gallon and better. Well, there aren't any. So we did a little Venn diagram. So if you selected all vehicles, it would be overlapping. That's great. Or you could select a subset of each category, and then the ones that had, for example, light vehicles, so the circle gets smaller, and we want to make sure that there's some overlap between these 5 categories. I don't know how helpful that illustration was. But that's the last slide in the presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, questions, comments beyond what we've already talked about? Outstanding, Travis.
Thanks.
Report. Gives a lot of clarity. I'd love to see, especially as a recovering politician, I would love to see you take that information and put it into a way that when Will and I or Norma go around and brief legislators, they get a very good understanding, because I would venture to say most don't understand even how our current gas tax and fuel tax collection system works, let alone what we might be. I'd never seen anything as succinct as that, so thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Any members of the public, questions, comments, or otherwise on what they've seen so far? No? Will?
I was just going to say, Mr. Chairman, that I think that every one of us that have been involved in going around and talking to people on the road charge here in California, one of the prime issues that is raised, as it was in the forum on Wednesday, is that my constituents or my business, we drive a lot of miles, and so we don't like a road charge or a mileage-based user fee because intuitively they think they're going to have to pay more. And this is just a constant question that comes up. You know, that one chart that you have that shows the cross lines, and there, I think is going to be very helpful in demonstrating that, because we always try to respond that you already pay more if you drive more miles via the gas tax. And I think that's a very good mechanism to demonstrate how that is. So when we talk about equity issues and things of that nature, if lower income families are driving, and many of them are not, but if they are, they're typically driving the older, lower mileage vehicles.
Yes, less fuel efficient.
Less fuel efficient vehicles, thank you. And they are, in fact, paying more from that perspective. So I thought this was an excellent presentation as well, and the information is very valuable.
Yeah, the one chart that's got the graph that shows, I mean, I think that, I don't know, you flip backward to that thing, Jeff, that is probably the most compelling chart right there, where you look and see, based on your mileage, what somebody's already paying by the mile right now. So they've got an older vehicle, they're probably paying 3.5, 4 cents a mile. And that's definitely a lot more than any number I've ever heard bantied about for a mileage charge. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, then let's move on, and we'll go from here now into I think some of the more interesting pieces of this. Is this going to be Travis? Oh, that's you. You're continuing on. Yeah. You don't get to sit.
I don't get to sit yet.
So this is the pilot evaluation criteria, which is item number 10 on our agenda, and Travis is going to continue.
Thanks for bearing with me.
What? Oh, wait, we got a speaker. I want to ignore our speakers. Oh, for 11. Okay. Be the next item. You're good. Go ahead. Thank you.
The other item we wanted to introduce today is pilot evaluation criteria, and I'll start with the agenda. We're first going to talk about the process and then some guidelines for developing criteria, and then we'll talk about the proposed criteria themselves, which are in your briefing book. There's 8 pages of them, and I believe they start on, help me out. Start on page 96. So the process, we'll go back to the statute, SB 1077, says the following. The Technical Advisory Committee may also make recommendations on the criteria to be used to evaluate the pilot program. It's that very interesting word, may. And we will be obviously developing evaluation criteria and evaluating the pilot, and you have the opportunity, should you so desire, to recommend those evaluation criteria. And at some point today, perhaps even right now, if you like, Mr. Chair, you'll have the opportunity to sort of affirm that you do indeed wish to make recommendations on evaluation criteria, or perhaps at the end of the presentation you can say, oh no, you nailed it, we're good. But we'd like to give you a chance to affirm that you would indeed like to make those recommendations. So we're in May here. So today we're presenting some introductory evaluation criteria, proposed criteria for your consumption and feedback. And we'll have two opportunities, should you so desire, to come back and provide that feedback. And I believe the schedule that we showed this morning has us finalizing the recommendations in June, but our internal schedule, if you require more time, you can go to July as well. We're flexible on that. But we wanted to give you the opportunity to absorb the draft criteria that you have in front of you and come back to us with written comments after the meeting and perhaps discussion in future meetings or recommendation to proceed next month. How do we go about developing evaluation criteria? Well, I want to step back first and again go over some vocabulary so that we're all talking about the same thing. And the terminology is often confused. So there's things like goals, criteria, measures, methods, and all sorts of synonyms for all of these things, like indicators and metrics and indices. So we wanted to stick to these four words, and we're going to use a pyramid to illustrate what they mean and who has the opportunity to carry out the development of goals and criteria. So above the dotted line is within the TAC's purview, and we are calling those goals and criteria. So as an example, a goal might be to allow user choice in recording and reporting methods. In fact, you've already, in some sense, enshrined that in one of your earlier meeting decisions. A corresponding evaluation criterion to assess that goal is market availability of mileage recording and reporting methods. This might seem a little bit pedantic, but when we're talking about criteria, we're talking about exactly that sort of item. It's a standard against which we can judge performance. Once you recommend the criteria, the California State Transportation Agency will be procuring an independent evaluator to evaluate the pilot. It won't be D'Artagnan, for example. It's going to be an independent organization. The independent evaluator will turn those criteria into measures. So an example of a measure, using this same example, is the number of methods available in the pilot. Seems relatively simple. And then lastly, they have to come up with a method to measure that. And the method would be that they would monitor and count the methods available in the pilot. So this is a relatively simple example. There's a lot of other criteria. I think we have 56 proposed altogether. And for each one of those criteria, the independent evaluator will be coming up with a corresponding measure and a methodology for actually doing the measurement as part of the pilot test. And one further example that I wanted to assure you will almost definitely or definitely be included as a method of measurement in the pilot is surveys of the participants in the pilot before, during, and after the pilot. That is one of the methods that we can use to measure some of these criteria.
I'm sorry, Travis, before you left that one slide, the above and the below the dash line,
Yes.
the below is then sort of the evaluation afterwards, or through the pilot and
Correct.
beyond the pilot, is that right?
That's right.
And I guess a general question I have, and forgive me if this was covered months ago, but does this committee have a role, or can it have a role in that evaluation later? Not as the evaluator, but any role?
I believe that certainly having input into the evaluation criteria is something that we would welcome if that's what you choose to do. Obviously, we're going to start with what's required in SB 1077 as a starting point, but if you have input into the process, certainly. We intend to select a vendor to do that evaluation process, and maybe in the selection of the vendor, we would have some of the CTC involved in that process. I'm not quite sure if there's another place in it. Certainly the information would come back to the TAC at some point so we could report back on what we're doing.
There, okay. I wanted to respond as well, and while there's no prescribed, again, the SB 1077 doesn't specify, we've had discussions from a staff perspective about the continuing engagement of the TAC throughout the process. I think it makes sense that you are going to be developing the criteria above the dotted line on this chart. And I believe it would be very helpful that the TAC would provide input, literally throughout the process. Now, when the pilot is actually ongoing, it may be nothing, your engagement may be nothing more than just giving you any sort of updates on how the pilot is progressing. But at the end, I think it would be helpful, since you have been engaged in this process from the beginning, to have input from the TAC as the recommendations go forward to the legislature. Now, again, that's not something that's spelled out in the legislation, but it seems to make a good deal of sense from a practical perspective. So that's kind of the discussions that we're having.
And I'll just add on. As I've said from the beginning, I looked at all of you as a 4-year stint on this thing. Now, obviously, it's been shortened a little bit, but it's crucial that each and every one of you, because you've become and will become subject matter experts in this thing as time moves forward, it's going to be important that you provide counsel to the legislature and others as they move forward. So it might be quarterly gatherings, it might be teleconferences, but I think it's incumbent on us, frankly, with no disrespect to the consultants or Caltrans or anybody else running the thing, to make sure that things that we've adopted are in fact adhered to. Susan?
I just wanted to add that actually in Senate Bill 1077, you will be receiving a report back from the Transportation Agency at the end of the pilot. And, and I know I called all of you and asked you to participate. The expectation, at least at that time, was that, you're going through all this, you're going to see the results of the pilot, you'll be getting a report back from the Transportation Agency. We would want to reconvene and hear from you your thoughts on the evaluation, the report that comes out from the Transportation Agency, and we would look to you for your input in advising the Commission. That's as a Commission staff member. Be looking for that as well. So.
Could I mention one other avenue
Please.
of potential involvement in evaluation? In its direct involvement, I hope most or all of you will consider being volunteers for the pilot itself. So the process that we went through, we meaning the project team, Caltrans, CTC staff, some of my colleagues, to develop the criteria that you have before you, think of it like a funnel. We looked at a lot of other sources of evaluation criteria that have been used on similar efforts in the past. We looked in SB 1077 itself. There were some criteria in the bill. The California Transportation Infrastructure Priorities Work Group developed a white paper last year which had, I believe, what they called principles, and those were adaptable and could be used as criteria as well. And we're continuing to look for feedback, obviously, from the TAC itself on the criteria. So all of that sort of funnels into the recommendations that we would like to put forward for your consideration for the pilot itself. And as part of that, we wanted to propose a few principles to guide what type of evaluation criteria we select. And hopefully these are self-evident. We want to use criteria that help us to meet policy objectives and stakeholder needs. We want criteria that are measurable, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, within the scope of the pilot. We want them to provide useful feedback to the ultimate decision makers. And we also want them to provide useful feedback to the potential implementers of a potential road charge in agencies and even private sector partners, so that they can understand how the performance was and what types of challenges they might face in the future. It would also be helpful if the criteria can have a life beyond the pilot test itself. If there is a decision to move forward with road charging, I would cite as an example the New Zealand road user charge system, which has been around since 1977 or 1978, and they do continuous evaluation of their system. In fact, they're in the second of 3 evaluation cycles right now, following some legislative reforms that were passed in 2012. And the second report was released not that long ago, and I believe the third report is expected sometime later this year. And so they are constantly evaluating how their performance is, and so what we're doing as part of the pilot could potentially live on and become a continuous performance measurement and management process. We want to build on other criteria that are used in other innovative transportation policy arenas. And to the extent possible, we don't want to have criteria that conflict with one another or overlap, because this could be confusing, but inevitably there will be some of that. So we just want to make sure that there's not too much. So without further ado, this table summarizes the criteria. We divided them into 8 categories so that they would be a little bit easier to digest rather than reading a long list of 56 criteria. And corresponding goals. In total, there are 36 goals and 56 corresponding criteria. I wanted to point out a couple of special criteria that were mentioned in SB 1077, and they kind of span all of those categories. I won't read them, but these were criteria that were explicitly mentioned in SB 1077, and they were mentioned as criteria for you to use in deciding which operational concepts to recommend for the pilot. So these are not explicitly required by the bill that you recommend these criteria to be used to evaluate the pilot. They were meant to be used internally for this body to decide which concepts to move forward. But they're very useful, and we think it'd be very important to include them as among the criteria that are used to evaluate the pilot itself. So we wanted to call these out to your attention. And then lastly, again, starting on page 96 in the briefing book, you can see all 56 criteria, and we would invite your feedback, written feedback, in particular if you think we missed something. If there are criteria that you would like to see that we didn't have, we'd like to consider that and add them to the list. Ultimately, if you so affirm your desire to recommend evaluation criteria, they will be yours to recommend. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Well, it was definitely very comprehensive. I don't know how you thought of 56 items. That was about 55 more than I could have thought of, so good job.
It was a team effort.
Any questions or comments on the evaluation criteria? Well, then thank you so much. That was outstanding information, and really kind of now leads us into, as usual with this group, we get into the policy decisions. And Carrie, I'll let you kick that off, and then we'll go from there. Oh, and you know what? I do have a public speaker, so what I'm going to do is, why don't you kick the thing off, and then I'm going to take the public speaker, and then we'll go into the staff presentation.
All right. Thank you, Chair. Taking into consideration the previous presentations and the discussion on the privacy protections, the business case analysis, we've identified some high-level policy decisions we would like the TAC to consider taking on today. Shannon will be going through the decision points for discussion and deliberation, and then we will be providing some staff recommendations live online. We can go ahead and edit them as needed. These are staff suggested recommendations, and I'm sure that you like to discuss and make some edits. So, Shannon?
Okay, before I call on Shannon, let me call Patricia Chen from LA Metropolitan Transportation Authority. If you'd please come forward, wanting to speak on item 11. And thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I am Patricia Chen from LA Metro, and I just want to say how interesting this process is and how supportive Metro is of taking this important step forward, and how humbled I am to be involved in a process with so many bright and talented people. I just wanted to briefly share some input I received when I talked about this new developing program to the Streets and Freeways Subcommittee that Metro hosts, which is a subcommittee to our Technical Advisory Committee. And I heard kind of two chief areas of concerns, and one was on equity considerations in terms of the heavier vehicles, that they really are the ones that have the most impact to the roads, and so they just wanted to express that they would like to see as many vehicle types included in the pilot and in the eventual program as possible. so that revenues are collected as well in the future as they are now. And then in terms of cost effectiveness of the program, they suggested that the most efficient way to move forward would be to at least only to require collection of data from the alternative fuel data vehicles. And that way you kind of ease into the process. Now that's a smaller portion of vehicles. Over time it grows and becomes a larger proportion, but we ease into the size of the program of collecting the data. And then so over time, I think there's a trend for more and more of the vehicles that are on the road to be using alternative fuels, or to be not using fuel, to be using electricity. And so the idea is that if you start the process up by just collecting the data and doing the special charge for the alternative fuel vehicles, you're starting with a smaller number of vehicles, and over time, as that becomes a larger and larger proportion of vehicles on the road, the program could then grow and we can adjust into the costs of collecting and dealing with the data.
That would be a suggestion not for the pilot program, but for the implementation of a VMT fee or a road charge after the pilot program.
Okay, so, and I'm just relaying information collected at this meeting, and I don't think it was necessarily specifically stated, and so, I suppose you could take that either direction and say, for the purposes of the pilot, let's collect from everyone, or you could say, well, if we really want the pilot to represent what's going to happen initially, then we should just collect from the alternative fuel vehicles. And then just one final point that was made is that, if we do that, it's going to be difficult with the hybrids because they pay gas tax, but would also need to be collecting data and doing some kind of a reconciliation process. And so perhaps it's important to make sure that a lot of different types of hybrid vehicles are in the pilot. I don't know if that means oversampling. Presumably, we're going to be trying towards some kind of statistical significance of a sample. So that would be an interesting area to consider. And that is all the input that I have to share at this time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Patricia, for being here, and appreciate your comments. I feel the same way. As an amazing group with a diversity of expertise in the room, so it's great to have you here as part of it as well. So thank you. Okay, well, let's go to Shannon. Let's start talking about some of the key policy decisions that we have for our May meeting today. And Shannon, why don't you kick it off?
Okay, so I'll revisit the 4 questions we started with this morning.
Get a little bit louder, if you could get the microphone closer to you.
A little bit. I don't want that horrible noise to happen again.
No, I think they fixed that.
I'm a little gun shy at this point. Okay, so we'll start by revisiting the 4 questions that were posed this morning, and then take them one by one and hopefully have some good discussion, and you'll have better ideas than I did when I was forming the questions, and we can have some action today. So just as a reminder, the 4 questions were: what types of participants should be included in the pilot? What types of vehicles are included in the pilot? Should there be road usage mileage exemptions to test in the pilot? And to refer back to the earlier question, Mr. Marcantonio, about should other kinds of exemptions occur, I think next month we'll be talking about what parts of the state, what kinds of demographic populations to include, and that might be the appropriate time to address that. So today, unless you direct otherwise, we'll limit it to mileage exemptions, just to keep it simple. And then the 4th question was what personal privacy protections should be used for the pilot. And so I believe Carrie has some recommendations to get the conversation started.
Yes, committee members, so based on, we're going to go one by one each question. So based on the what types of participants. Staff recommends recruiting individuals, households, businesses, and at least one government agency to participate in the pilot. We basically thought, why narrow the field at this point? Let's keep them all in play and see how that works out when we start getting into the cost analysis.
You know, at the risk of jumping the gun or something like that, I would move that we, adopt that recommendation. I mean, I think, I one of the ideas we've talked about over a few months is making the pilot as comprehensive as possible to evaluate all aspects, recognizing time limitations and budget limitations. So I don't see any reason why we wouldn't want to do that.
Got it. We have a motion from Finnegan, second from Sauer.
I had a clarifying question. Does this include the out-of-state drivers that we had discussed previously as well? Would that be included?
That is your call right now. We have said that we would include out-of-state drivers. We have not really specified whether those out-of-state recruits would constitute individuals, households, businesses. I think this decision, the way that it's currently phrased, would allow the flexibility to do one or more of those groups with the out-of-state volunteers.
And I'm going to make a case that we continue to include out-of-state, because clearly if we're wanting to create a system that's going to work, and I'll just go far to say it, that could end up becoming a national model, I think we need to make sure that we have that data set in place that works statewide. Supervisor?
Can you define how you're including households in this participant area?
Yeah, I don't know, we got to turn off our microphones, I guess, so we can. Does it work?
Okay, here we go. So, yes, the households are composed of individuals. The difference would be that we would recruit entire groups of either related or cohabiting people and hopefully convince them to test different methods within that household unit, so that in the instance that you had a mother and father and an 18-year-old child and maybe a 21-year-old child who was at Fresno State attending school, and all four had cars or pickup trucks or motorcycles or whatever, try to get one of those people to test, option one, another person to test option two. What that does, it does make it a little bit more challenging to recruit within the demographic groups or the economics groups that we go after. However, it allows us to do some interesting surveying, or the independent evaluator to do some interesting surveying of those people, because they'll have the opportunity to compare and contrast the different methods and have hands-on experience with more than one method. Whereas just going after individuals, where maybe one member of a household has a technology or an option, a sticker, a whatever on their car, they have that experience with that one thing, and it may be positive, it may be negative, but they don't really know how it works compared to other options. So that was the thinking behind the idea that you might have an individual versus a unit of 2 or 3 or 4 people.
So you get a family basically that one's using a smartphone, one's doing paper, one's got a tag, and then they can all compare notes. The third-party evaluator would look at that interview, see what you could learn from that process.
That's exactly correct, yeah. And it was also offer from the service provider perspective the opportunity potentially, and I don't certainly today want to dictate what any of the account providers or account managers would do, but to potentially set up some sort of additional services that are kind of like a cell phone family plan or a single invoicing option for the entire household, rather than 4 different people in the household receiving 4 invoices every month because they are registered separately.
I like that.
So it's opportunities for different kinds of testing.
Supervisor?
And I can understand the efficiency, perhaps, that would be gained by using the household concept. But in one household, you might have 4 drivers, 4 different kinds of vehicles, and they may swap in and out. So the mom may take the SUV one day and take, something else, the sedan, the next day. They might have an electric vehicle. One might be, hybrid. and one might go to school, so the daughter might go up to school and use one car one week and something else the next week. So I don't know. To me, it might be more confusing rather than give more clarity with using a household basis for the participant group. Unless it's very, very strictly defined, you've got mom using the hybrid and method A for the entire test case. Otherwise, they're mixing and matching, and then we don't get clarity with regard to the outcome and the numbers.
Well, so I can tell you that the measurement and reporting option that is chosen for a vehicle is tied to that vehicle regardless of who's driving it.
Okay.
I agree that if you get into a situation where somebody goes out on an unplanned 10,000-mile road trip and mom and dad are trying to figure out who did that, there could be a little bit of confusion within the family. But we think that the household concept also does, in a lot of ways, reflect reality, that if this rolls out at any point in the future, you will have households participating. And so it's just an opportunity to test how that would work and get feedback from potential customers.
All right.
I'm sorry. To add on to that point, I think what this direction is that the pilot should include individuals as such, just in individual households as defined and as may participate. And you're absolutely right. There may be complexities with that, but the pilot, that's maybe part of the role of the pilot is to figure that out, and then the business and the government agencies as well. So I think conceptually we want to include as much as possible, not to confound the pilot, but to get as much information and find out what the pitfalls are, what works and what doesn't work, and what the issues.
Yeah, I just want to say I really like the family plan approach. The public is used to that with cell phone packages. When we all started, it was all individual, and then competition said, let's just have a pool of minutes. You could have a pool of miles. So I think that's a good one. Marty?
In principle, I agree with the recommendations, and I think the diversity of participants is appropriate. So I don't mean to be hostile by asking some questions. I think it's really important also to consider that this suggests that we would have a separate recruitment process for businesses and government agencies and individuals and households for each, and that would add cost. And then, in addition, it suggests a separate evaluation process. You wouldn't ask the same questions of a government agency as you would a household, or of a business as you would an individual. So, in coming to this recommendation, did you consider cost and complexity and recruitment? And then in the next one, you talk about 8 vehicle weight classes and different registration groups. We're seeking volunteers to sign up for this, and the previous speaker used the word sample. I mean, we're not going to be able to design a sample as one does when you do like a telephone survey. We're going to rely upon volunteers, and the threat to this is to me our ability to actually implement it. It's the cost of the diverse recruitment, the cost of the many different evaluations, and the challenge of filling out the matrix. If you assure me that we can do all of that, I'm all for it. But I'm worried that we're just being a little too idealistic and saying we want to do A and B and C and D and all of these things, and we're depending upon volunteers.
And can I just add to that what's the sample size that we're aiming at? And I in particular, for instance, I'm very interested and concerned that we make sure that we have an adequate sample size of rural, suburban, urban, low-income participants.
When are we going to have that discussion on the size of the sample? Is that at the next month?
Next month. The number of participants is a decision for next month.
Ballpark? 10,000? I have no.
Somewhere between 100 and 100,000.
I'm sorry?
We had a stakeholder group that examined this issue previously that passed I thought it was on. Excuse me. We had studied this previously. There were a group of, 50, 60 stakeholders. A smaller group looked at this issue, and there were recommendations that were made to study this. And their recommendation was a sample size between 5,000 and 6,000. So that's the rough number that we use to estimate the cost for the pilot.
How big was Oregon's?
They're going to be doing 10,000 starting on
5,000. They've done a smaller amount.
The first pilot was 300, and the second pilot there were 86. What?
86.
As a researcher, I would say there's some clear benefit to working intensely with a small sample. It's a different approach. It's not representative, but it gives you deeper data. And, in the early phases of something like this, Oregon, I think, chose wisely. We have also political considerations. If we reported to the whole state, we did a detailed sample of 86, we'd be laughed out of the legislature. But there are challenges to being all-inclusive, because then you would have very little data about any individual class or group.
If I could add to this, I guess, I think there are two things at play here. One is the breadth of what we're trying to evaluate, and that is the different types of participants and vehicles and all of that. The other, what is as I keep mentioning, I think, what is practical in the budget and timeframes that we have to work with. And I think it's incumbent upon the consultants and staff to let us know if we're going to bump up against a problem with that. I think the direction from this group should be the direction from the group. And again, you guys need to let us know, not necessarily now, but as we go along, if there are some problems and we have to revisit. You keep on talking about revisiting things as we go along, and if there's a need to revisit some of this.
I would just like a point of clarification on can we specify out-of-state participants somewhere in the record to make sure that we are including motorists, possibly commercial vehicles as well, in the testing?
Yeah, I think you clearly have already made the decision to involve out-of-state vehicles, and we're testing sort of a different set of metrics by the engagement of out-of-state vehicles. So I don't think my suggestion would be that you don't have to be bothered by any limitations that are selected for the in-state participants, households, individuals, et cetera, businesses. So what you could recommend and could decide as a group is that, yes, we're going to do out-of-state travel, out-of-state vehicles, which you already have done that, and that drivers from neighboring states, that we would have at least participants from both the commercial and private side. And there's no indication there of numbers or anything else, but you could just specify that the drivers from neighboring states who drive regularly in California will be recruited to participate in the pilot. It says right here in the book, and I did read that. and then indicate that we want to have the split between commercial and private.
But I'll just say this: if you want to include that in this motion to reaffirm, it's up to the maker and the seconder of the motion. That's totally fine. I understand where you're coming from, Supervisor.
Oops. I think the sample size, too, will also be determined by the number of methods for data collection, because if you've got, say, 9 participant classes, and we've got 6 data collection methods, you really need to have all 6 data collection methods with each participant class to get accurate feedback on the different methods for collection with each type of participant. So to the extent that we can kind of hone down the number of methods for data collection, that will keep our sample size a little bit smaller.
Yeah,
Supervisor-
I'm sorry.
Let me call on Supervisor Finnegan, then Richard.
Yeah, and I'm willing to talk about it next time when we talk about the size, but what I would caution us to give special thought to is those groups that have assumptions and fears be included, and I'm talking about rural, ultra-rural, suburban, urban, by category, not by the way we...
I would really strongly like to suggest, for all the reasons that have just been stated, that we come back next month and see a sort of a matrix of, with this sample size and with this many kinds of, participants and this many kinds of vehicles and this many other considerations, here's how we're going to get a realistic sample size for each of the groups that we...
I think that's an outstanding idea. So I'm getting an affirmative on that. All right. So we have a motion by Finnegan, second by Hans for item 1 as written, and then we'll reaffirm that matrix next month showing what we talked about earlier, as Will indicated, the out-of-state, et cetera. Any further discussion on our first policy decision? Marty?
Just amend what you said too, but please offer some suggestions about recruitment as part of this discussion. I'm particularly concerned, I'm just not convinced that an assertion that we should include out-of-state people will result in out-of-state people standing up and saying, I want to be part of this. I mean, it's a very serious
I don't
challenge
disagree with
to
you,
recruit
but
them.
we got to start someplace, and so what we'll end up doing is coming back to that as far as the machinations on how to make that happen. I think we're good.
Well, I think that we can target that. I think you have people in El Dorado County that they can go with their neighbors in Reno or whatever. I know myself, I can go to Brookings to their city council or something and recruit people. So I think we have that method in our hands to be able to do that.
Absolutely, and thank you. Key to this whole process is to get this volunteer base. And I think with a state of 40-some-odd million people, if we do 5,000 or 6,000, I don't think we're going to have a tough time. But the key is, are we going to get the diversity that'll give us the best results? And that's really the important piece. Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Oh, I'm sorry. It was Eric. Pardon me. Motion from Finnegan, second from Sauer on policy item number 1. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? That one abstention from Mark Antonio. Motion passes unanimously with the abstention noted. Okay, so now let's go to item 2.
Item 2, we're going to be addressing the vehicle types included. We've broken this into 2 recommendations, one being vehicle class and the other one based on fuel type. Staff recommends adopting a 8x2, meaning all 8 classifications, weight classifications that Travis went over, as well as the being a private and commercial registration for discussion of vehicle types included in the pilot.
Okay.
You want me, number 2 is staff recommends including in the pilot a cross-section of vehicles reflective of all vehicles currently driving in California. That's including all the fuel types being EV, hybrid, diesel, fossil fuel.
Sounds good. Eric?
I think Will addressed this in a previous meeting, but the statute only specifies gasoline. Is it a problem if we include diesel? It's kind of a technical question. I mean,
It doesn't,
I've never assumed that we wouldn't.
What do you think? You okay with it including diesel?
well, no, I'm just saying technically, because, I'm letting the cat out of the bag here. My board has directed me to vote for us to be included in the pilot. But going on technical language that's included in SB 1077, I think it only specifies gasoline.
I've already asked Will. The CTC is going to buy a new microphone system, and we are going to bring it to every meeting. Or I'll buy it personally and bring it.
Eric, this is not unusual that I don't specifically remember that conversation, but I think the The issue would be that I believe 1077, the only reference that I can recall in 1077 to diesel versus gasoline is talking about an alternative to the gas tax, which is fairly specific. But again, this is, I believe, this is your call in terms of whether or not, and it certainly makes sense that commercial vehicles would be involved in the pilot, and that I don't see any restriction, not an attorney, but I don't see any restrictions.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to throw a curveball or anything or gum up the process, because as I had mentioned earlier, our board did direct us to participate in the pilot, so I just, there's a
Yes,
point of clarification.
I agree. My counsel says.
If I could just add in on that one, appreciate that very much. I think that's an important step that you guys are taking. I think also that, maybe it's an inartful wording of the legislation, the sort of the gas tax as a common use for fuel taxes. And I think that certainly that could lead to policy decisions and discussions later. But for the pilot purposes, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I just, first of all, I want to say thank you to the trucking industry because when we first started this, I just assumed that you all wouldn't be wanting to be included. The fact that you wanted to take that step, I think, is going to be huge in confidence to all of the motoring public in California. And the fact this includes all 8 classes, I think, is good too. As far as diesel, hey, if EV is there, that's the same type of thing. So I think we're in good shape. Please.
I think the long-standing issues that the industry has had, or, we had discussed that thoroughly within our policy committee discussions, and the consensus from the group was we're looking kind of in the future. The politics are different in California. There's a zero-emission mandate that's coming at some point down the road. But the consensus pretty much was, let's see if it could work and why it wouldn't work. And so why not be involved in the pilot to look at those 2 items?
Oh, congratulations on that. Richard?
For both Decision 1 and Decision 2, I really think there's a distinction to be drawn between the characteristics that we'd like to invite as we go out soliciting participants and the must-have characteristics. And I think we've talked about rural, urban. I've raised low income. I think I feel like if what we're deciding here is who are we going to open it up to, and then we may just get like one of a certain category and realize it's not even worth including them. That's a technical decision maybe. But I really feel like when we see the matrix, I hope that we will see the must-have kind of demographics, geography, et cetera. And I don't even know that we've had that whole discussion, but I feel like that really should be what's driving this. And then we fit this in to the best of the ability to bring those particular groups into the study.
As your chair, in listening to this and following this, when I see should, that means it's must. These things should be included in the pilot. And I haven't heard anybody say they're optional. I think we need to make sure we have all of those included, whether it's the different types of vehicles, the households, the individuals. Certainly item 2, which is before us now, it's probably the best way to get the best results of a pilot to see how it might end up working. Lauren, and then Lee.
And maybe this will be clearer next month, kick the can down the road a little bit, when we see what all the different variables are, because this is a multivariable issue here. But I'm just looking at that right now. I see 8 times 2 times number of fuel types divided among various, or you have lots of, and I'm not sure that and of course not all of the 8 are commercial, so there's, but I see at least in number 2A there, that being aspirational. What we really, really care about are these light-duty vehicles and really, and the heavy commercial vehicles, because that is 99% of the vehicles on the road. And I'd hate to see, when we designed the pilot program and Caltrans is out there trying to recruit this or the consultants, and they're beating their heads against the wall under an abbreviated time frame trying to make this happen, that they didn't get 422 Class 6 natural gas vehicles. So anyway, I just want to be, I don't want to get, I'm really concerned about the overall size of it and making sure that our target audiences are there and not get too bogged down in bureaucratic box checking.
May I offer one point of clarification? On the first recommendation, the idea was not to say that you must recruit vehicles from 16 different buckets with however many different fuel types. The point of the first thing was really to say, moving forward, for the sake of common understanding, we'll agree that the way that we will describe vehicles is by the 8 different weight classes and then public or private, so that we're not having conversations around fuel type, around vehicle age. Well, so the second one is to include a cross-section that is reflective of what's currently on the road. I don't know statistically that what's currently on the road matches that 8 by 2 by 4 by whatever set matrix that would turn out to be. But the point of the first motion or the first recommendation is just to establish a common language, so that when we talk about what to include, numbers within each group, that sort of thing, we're all speaking the same language. The second one is really talking about, we want the panel in the pilot to be reflective of what's on the road currently.
Lauren, if I could attempt to answer your question as well. Has it? Good. I mean, I think we just, part of it is how expansive is the direction coming from this group. And if we wanted to only do Class 1 vehicles, that would be a major decision, and that would inform the pilot. The decision, if we move down this path, is to try to include all vehicles. That doesn't mean we're going to have a representative sample of every conceivable vehicle, ownership, fuel, and other type possible, color.
Right. I mean, I now don't take that to mean that we need the same number of LNG vehicles as anything else. So it means that you define sort of where what you're taking from, and then you adjust according to what questions you actually need to answer and what groups you actually need to poll more seriously. So you could have a much heavier number of vehicles in one class than another, if that's what makes sense for what you're trying to do.
But again,
it doesn't require that.
I think we have clarified it. And to Lauren's point, there's 24.7 million automobiles and motorcycles, 8.2 million trucks and commercial vehicles. The bulk is in the lighter vehicles, but we're not excluding anybody from review. Supervisor Bartlett.
Okay. Although we may not have every type of vehicle covered in the pilot program, but in every specific area, we definitely need to have every method of data collection, because I know in some of these areas, I sit on CSAC, and there are 58 counties, and we had a group meeting about various things, and I'm surprised at the number of some of these little rural areas where they don't even have consistent internet coverage. So some of the technology-based systems that we are considering here may not work in some of those really small, the rural areas that are within the state. So we have to keep that in mind.
Okay, so on item 2 on our policy decisions, I'm getting a motion from Sauer, second from TM. On that, any further discussion? All in favor, please vote by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? One abstention, Mark Antonio. The motion passes. All right, let's go to policy decision number 3.
Members, we are going to be talking about the road usage mileage exemptions. This is broken down into 2 recommendations. Staff recommends testing both automated and manual methods to offer exemptions from paying road charges for mileage driven on private roads. And 2, staff recommends testing both automated and manual methods to offer exemptions from paying road charges for mileage driven outside of California.
Okay, any questions, comments on that? Motion Finnegan, is there a second? Got it?
Is this an exhaustive list of exemptions that will be offered in the pilot, or will there be opportunity to discuss other exemptions?
You have the opportunity to propose and discuss other exemptions right now.
Hearing none.
I thought I heard that next month we
For,
would come
for,
back.
for mileage
Mileage,
exemptions.
thank you.
And then next month, as we get into the demographic and economic analysis and selecting where in the state that those kinds of decisions, you can propose further additional exemptions.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Marty?
Does general location mileage reporting, general location, county? Is that a reasonable assertion that, and for a level of aggregation? Would it be a 10-block area, a county? Northern California versus Southern California? What is general location-based
So
mileage reporting
the
imply?
general location-based mileage reporting would be specific enough to be able to determine whether you were on a private road or a public road, but location data would not be reported back to detailed enough to know exactly where you were, would not be reported back.
Didn't we discuss that sort of like GPS versus odometer?
Yes, yes. And this is one of the general location-based mileage reporting is one of the operational concepts. The important distinction is that while the device in your vehicle can determine whether you're on-road or off-road or in-state or out-of-state, it is not reporting at any point where you, is not tracking where you've gone.
One possibility that has been discussed in the literature, just theoretically, is, for example, that self-help counties might opt into a mileage-based fee rather than a sales tax, which is what we have 30, 40 counties, 30-something counties levying a sales tax. If a county said, we want into this pilot program because we would like to consider a mileage-based fee within our county as our option, I'm thinking that county-level reporting of VMT would be a very valuable capacity. That was, I just had that.
I love the professor thinking ahead, 10, 20 years into this thing. That we have to first get Kurt Augustine to allow us to have that in all the vehicles, and then we could go from there. Yeah. Somebody over here? Oh, I'm sorry, Stephen.
I'm sorry, I was just going to add, I think that for the purposes of this decision, it's just public versus private roads, in-state, out-of-state. So obviously, you're looking at different issues later on, which are policy issues. To the extent we have GPS as an option, then any of that is conceivably possible.
Lee, and then Richard, yes.
Yeah, so I had also noticed the general versus specific location issue before, but it seems to me that that's something that I think that you have to flag as an issue that very much requires an actual empirical assessment within the sort of evaluation criteria area, because I was unable to determine just what general meant from reading the briefing materials. I get it now, but even so, there are many ways to have a general location output, but they don't necessarily have the same overall privacy effects depending on what information is collected. And I guess that's the one side issue there is how much of any of the information that would be collected here would be subject to the Public Records Act. Whether in the pilot program or in any actual future program, I don't actually know whether there's any kind of statutory special exemption or not for that kind of data.
Well, my own response, and the consultants can respond, but in looking at some of the constitutional information that was in our backup, there are certain provisions that allow them to say, to give some information and some is protected. But again, from a policy perspective, there isn't anything that prevents you in your recommendations as a technical advisory committee for what ultimately might be a legislative package to add some additional privacy protections. Personally, I think that's what we would want. Because I don't think you're going to sell this to the public if they think, 5 minutes after you've driven someplace, somebody's going to be able to subpoena you and use that against you in some form or fashion. And I think those are issues that have to be considered. It's the big data, item that's out there. So those are all issues, unless you opt in. So there's got to be, but I think you've got to have protections for the very issue from the day that we first met that you raised, otherwise this program is just not going to really work if you don't have those protections in place. Supervisor?
Yeah, I don't mean to overstate the obvious. Page 26 and page 27, we went over all this, and part of that was the potential privacy protection measures for all of those. So maybe.
Yeah, we've covered them. There's no question. Okay, we have. I apologize.
I really want to just make one more attempt at saying why I'm extremely concerned about decisions 1 through 3 today. I think that we have the cart, the sort of the technical cart leading the horse, which is, how much of this do we want to see in California is going to put a lot of time and money, is already putting a lot of time and money into developing and running a pilot program where I think we all agree a lot is at stake, okay? What do we really need to get out of this? How much do we need in Northern California versus Southern California? How much do we need in rural versus urban? How much do we need in lower income demographic, different other demographics? And we haven't discussed any of that. Instead, we've now got, if you multiply all this stuff, I'm not going to try. I'm not the mathematician that Lee is. But if you multiply all this by all of the operational concepts that we want to include, it's mind-boggling. And we haven't decided what the sample size is, much less what do we really, really need to get out of this at the end of the day. So I just want to say that's why I'm abstaining.
So that's your reservation.
I hope that we'll come back next month and actually be able to have that conversation in the context of a recommendation.
Well, why don't you offer a comment on it?
There. I heard a number of you raise that sort of issue, and so what I would suggest, and I have a question through Caltrans to the consultant, is whether so we get this on the radar screen, so to speak, and that it's part of a future decision point where we would have the specific discussion that you're talking about, Richard, and we would bring back this matrix that we've talked about next month if we have the time to do that, and we would look at questions of and try to make some estimates relative to sample size, look at social equity, look at geographic exemption potential, or look at or how many, not necessarily exemptions, but what would be the appropriate sample size from a geographic perspective and a demographic perspective, and come back to you with this matrix that then would foster additional discussion based on what we've been talking about with respect to the $5,000 to $6,000 overall, $5,000 to $6,000 individual overall sample size, and try to put some meat on the bones, as it were, so that you have a comfort level that, and if you agree with that approach, that could be the targets. I think what the consultant has been telling us is that you're not necessarily going to get 32 people in this particular class or whatever, but we could at least have some targets where we think it's meaningful to have that distinction and to capture that data. So I think this matrix is really a very positive, important piece of input to you as you make these future decisions, and it would have the additional benefit, Richard, of getting those other potential exemption questions on the calendar for consideration. So, because I went back and looked after you talked, and it's not on there. We've agreed that could be done, but it's not specifically listed on the target or the plan decision-making timeline.
It will
so yeah, and so would something like that give you more comfort?
Excellent.
And so, from the consultant perspective,
Got a thumbs up from the consultant.
through Caltrans? Okay.
Thank you, Nora. All right, I don't think we have a motion from anybody on number 3, but I'll certainly take one.
I move that we do what Joe just said.
I'll tell you what, you're going to abstain on number 3, but we'll make sure that Will's statement is definitely recorded and responded to as its own agenda item at the next meeting, all right? Oh, that's right, it was, pardon me.
That was like...
About 20 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Which seems like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
All right, motion Finnegan, second Portraits on item 3. Any other discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? One abstention? The motion passes. All right, so that's good. Let's go to number 4.
There. Item number 4, it's what specific personal privacy protections we'd like to use for the pilot. Staff has 3 recommendations before you. First, staff recommends adoption of Approach 1, the road charge privacy protection principles. Staff further recommends directing Caltrans to develop draft privacy principles document for TAC review and comment prior to the July TAC meeting. Recommendation 2, staff recommends adopting Approach 3, the pilot program accountability measures, with the requirement that the independent evaluator will evaluate the pilot program's performance on privacy protection using the evaluation criteria proposed in the May 2015 briefing book, and also measure performance against the California Road Charge pilot privacy protection principles adopted by the TAC. And finally, recommendation 3, staff recommends adoption of Approach 4, development and recommend model legislative provisions. Staff further recommends directing Caltrans to draft model legislation for review and comment by the TAC prior to the July TAC meeting.
Can you talk about, this is an agnostic question, just for informational purposes for me, why Approach 2 you had decided to not recommend inclusion?
Thank you, Gino. Okay. Because we haven't addressed enforcement and some of the other measures, we wanted to hold that one over for further consideration. But right now, we didn't feel like it was ripe for adoption, quite frankly.
Can I just say, I think number 2, I like the recommendation to include a bunch of these. I think number 2 is critical if technology is going to be developed for this program, that's going to then be on the shelf for the future. I think that's my understanding of what Approach 2 is about. So I don't want us to lose that.
Mr. Chair, if it helps, we'd be happy to amend the recommendations in front of you to include carrying forward Recommendation 2, which was the specifications approach, to a future meeting after you've heard about enforcement-related issues.
Is everybody okay with that? Yes. Okay.
So just a point of clarification, so what I'm sort of hearing is all of the above with details to be figured out.
Back to you before the July meeting for...
All right, at the July meeting. We'll get it. And so we're going to get the matrix, we're going to get the item that Will's talked about, we're going to get that, and we're also going to get a list of all the documents that are coming at everybody, and we're going to make sure you have them all in advance of the meeting, and if you don't, we're going to point to a hyperlink on the website or something so you can download it. So that way everybody has had a chance to see everything so they don't get it at the meeting. Okay.
Except the matrix comes at the June meeting.
Yeah, the matrix is at the June meeting. Right. Okay. Supervisor.
Okay. And then, rather than inventing the wheel, if we could direct staff to contact the transportation corridor agencies, the toll roads, they've got existing privacy protection policies pursuant to toll collection law, and a lot of that information could be very helpful for us here.
Quick comment, we actually did have a phone meeting with Mr. Jackson.
Samuel Jackson? Great.
Samuel.
Perfect.
Samuel, okay. And we've started that conversation, so he was very helpful.
Wonderful. Yes. Great.
Okay, so that's item 4, with the items noted, changed. Any other questions or comments? Who's making the motion? Got him, Hans. Moved. Second by Wax. Any other questions, comments? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? No abstentions. The item passes unanimously. All right, thank you very much. Okay, well, it looks like we are where we all wanted to be about right now. But let's, I don't know about that either, yeah. 18 minutes ago, that beer is now warm. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so Carrie, let's go through item number 12 then, if you would.
This should be fairly brief as Jeff comes back over here. We have been keeping track of our discussions today, and as you noted, we will be coming back with the matrix in June. In July, we'll have some reports back from the Caltrans, but I think Jeff has some other items that he kept track of. Sorry, Jeff.
I do.
Hang on. Here.
What's that last one? You might have to help me with. Okay, thank you, committee members. For action items, we have, number 1, to review the transform letter, and for that matter, all the letters that have been submitted to the TAC for project team review and written comment back to the TAC, so that you have the project team's response to the comments that you received. Number 2, we will ensure that the written responses to the questions raised at TAC meetings, including this one, will be distributed to the TAC at the same time as the other presentation materials, so you have more time to take those under consideration. Item 3 is CTC will provide written summaries of the work group meetings to the TAC members as another point of information on opinions and positions out there. Item 4, we will look into attempting to simulate as many transaction processes and payment details as possible, even if it's a null value, $0 value, in order to detect potential privacy and data security issues, as well as individual motorists' reactions to paying a road charge or a gas tax. Item 5 will examine the feasibility of allowing motorists to voluntarily pay, perhaps with real money, a road charge in the pilot project. Those are the action items. We have some parking lot items, which just means that they'll come up in due course. The first one is keeping the TAC informed and updated on how the tax decisions, just similar to the discussion we just had, are affecting the schedule for the pilot project demonstration phase, so the actual carrying out of the project. Another report back or parking lot is to research and report back on the legal and or technical limitations on why we can only simulate road charge payments rather than collecting actual money. Another one is to describe how and when the TAC will pick a mileage rate to test in the pilot project. So what rate you're going to test, how you're going to make that decision and when. And the final one of a parking lot is how the TAC will consider exemptions for other reasons, equity reasons, again, the follow-on discussion that we just had. And then last, I guess, in addition, is what you just discussed, coming back to you with a matrix of the decisions made to date, what that might look like in terms of sample size, and what we need to be thinking about in terms of a recruitment strategy. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
I think that there was also that we would make sure that we add those other exemption questions to the future discussion items so that they're on the calendar and we don't overlook them, that we know that that's going to be further discussed as well.
Okay, thank you.
if any other exemptions would be included or not, or talked about. Is that for next month, or is that probably beyond next month?
I think based on the discussion that we thought those might come after some of the, I heard enforcement and some of the other things. So those might be more for the July meeting, but they would at least be on the calendar. But the matrix is intended, at least my proposal was to be pretty all-inclusive, to talk about those things and to have, to look at that aspect of it in terms of trying to determine how the sample size gets split up. Or what we determine we need to gain from a particular segment in order to have a realistic pilot exercise.
I would just like to add one small matter. The Oregon experiment is supposedly going live July 1. Perhaps it would be really good in June or July or maybe August to have a report on how it's going, and in particular, I'd love to learn lessons about recruitment from their experience. Because my understanding was they were actually having quite a lot of difficulty getting 5,000 people at the beginning, and maybe by now they've mastered that. So it would be valuable information for us.
Well, I'll tell you what, we're going to be in Sacramento at the next meeting where technology might work a little bit better. Maybe we'll get Jim Whitty on Skype or something, and he can talk to the whole group, or bring him down here.
And he did offer to come down maybe a month or so after they go live, and I think the intent was not that they would have 5,000 day one, but, subsequently they would be adding to those numbers.
Yeah, I just heard that. 5,000 per capita in Oregon is a heck of a...
I don't know how many
yeah.
in California.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. Supervisor?
Just, and not to overextend, I know Kiana's from CSAC's in the audience, but we have state associations, you have the League of Cities, you have other trade organizations. Use us, lean on us when it comes to getting volunteers.
T-shirts and caps. All right. Okay, let's move to public comment. Any non-agenda public comment from members of the audience that didn't get a chance to speak to anything on the agenda? Now is your chance. Seeing none, our next meeting is Friday, June 26th, in beautiful downtown Sacramento. So we thank you all for being here today. This has been an outstanding meeting, and I just want to say thank you personally to each and every one of you on the Technical Advisory Committee. Your attendance has been outstanding, your participation phenomenal, and it really is going to create a much better result for the state of California because of it. So thank you very much. We're adjourned.